true for all subjects. What happens in Europe is that there's a focus on the lab or the supervisor rather than the university itself.
Excuse me.
Um,
Sorry to interrupt. So just to tell everybody that this is being recorded. So please mind your
yeah,
words.
yeah. So yeah, so in Europe, the focus is, so when you're applying to Europe, you're not really applying to a university. You're more likely applying to a lab, or in the case of math, you usually apply to groups or you apply to a supervisor. So supervisors or like professors, they tend to list out, they advertise positions that are open, and otherwise there would be a group. So for example, for probability, there would be a group of probability, and or they would club it with probability and statistics, or you'd have a group for algebra and number theory, or just algebra, or just number theory, and so on. So you can look up university websites, of course, but you one good way to start looking at people to apply to would be to look at research. So would be to look at research papers. So for your master's thesis, I'm assuming you would have been given some papers to read, or at least you would be reading one paper, or would have started reading one paper by now. And you should look up who the authors or co-authors of that paper are. And well, if there's someone not from Europe, they might have a collaborator in Europe. So you can look up what their network is, who they've collaborated with. Otherwise, you can just take like a wild dart and you can start anywhere. And so maybe pick a country that you really like in Europe. Say you pick up France, and then there are certain um, well organizations in France. So France has universities, for example, but the key research places in France are more like organizations. So the two key places that I know of are, one is called CNRS and the other is called INRIA, INRIA. I'll write out the name in the chat as well. So, like I said, these are groups, and the people here aren't really professors, they're researchers. So, when you look at the profile, they would have mentioned themselves as researchers. So, so when you apply to a person in Europe, you should like list out what your research interests are, and this should be in detail and specific. So a PhD in Europe typically lasts for about 3 years. One exception to this is a PhD in Netherlands, which lasts for 4 years, and of course a PhD in UK, which is another exception. Puneet will explain more about the UK applications, but I'm talking about the rest of Europe, not UK. So they typically have PhD that lasts for 3 years, and what happens here is that you immediately start with your research. So as you see, that 3 years is not a very long time period, or even 4 years for that matter, and due to which the coursework here is not compulsory. So you do courses on the way if you feel you need to pick up certain areas. So which is why the screening process in Europe it focuses on what your interests are and well how much you know about uh, your interests. For example, you need not know everything in detail because your 3 years out of your three major years at IISER, the third year onwards, only two of them go in coursework, and of course you can't cover all topics in detail in that, right? If even if you pick up something like um, say probability, you don't do a lot of probability in this major years in IISER, but you should have. So in the so the first key part of a screening process in Europe is the interview. If you're shortlisted for an interview, they will not really ask you too many grilling questions, but they will gauge what you know about the field. And by know, I don't mean you can prove everything, you know all the theorems. By know, by this knowing aspect, I mean that how much do you like the field? How much are you willing to explore in the field? And what like you should have an idea of where the field is moving in present day. Like again, because I've worked in probability, I'll pick up the example of probability. If someone asks me what are current research areas in probability, I would be able to name a few of them, right? So this is something you should know as well. If depending on what your interest is, if someone asks you something about algebraic geometry, for example, you should know what current research focuses on. So you can't be blank in an interview, and they might ask you a bit about your fundamentals, and fundamentals usually is analysis algebra, linear algebra especially, depending on what, of course, your topic is going to be. So the key part here, of course, is the interview, and the email that you send out usually should definitely mention what your thesis topic is. So the European application process focuses a lot on what your master's thesis is because they sometimes tend to build up on what you've been doing, right? Like I said, so in contrast, in the USA, you get to do about 2 years of coursework. So you don't really have a supervisor, you don't have well, you don't really choose a topic in the beginning. But in Europe, since it's a 3 year position, you are applying to a very specific position, which is why you should know what you're applying to. You should not apply to anything and everything. You should apply only to things that you think you can pursue further for 3 years. So yeah, that is more or less it about Europe. Um, Another key part of your email should be SOPs, a statement of purpose, and the statement of purpose has to be something very original. If you try, well, you try copying or pasting it, from what I understand, uh, people can make out if it's copied or if it's not an original piece. And if they believe it to be original, they will make out if it they will find out the truth in the interview process anyway. So, oh, also, never lie in the interview. So if they ask you that, can like, do you know this or can you prove this? Uh, don't confidently go and say yes, I know completely about this, because fine, they might accept you for that position, but remember, it's going to be a 3 year position after that, and you're the one who's going to be stuck with it. So if you don't know something, the supervisor should know that you don't know this, so that the supervisor can help you out. The supervisor should not take you assuming you know something. And well, like I said, Puneet can talk a bit more about interviews as well. Um, yeah, that's more or less what I can remember from my application processes. Um, one last key point I would mention here is, so like, how I got my position. So I applied to this professor in Germany. Her name is Nina Gantert, and she works in probability. She didn't have any openings, any funded openings, but she still. So I requested, like, is it still possible to have a discussion with you? And that turned out to be really helpful for me because she gave me the links of an opening that was somewhere else in Netherlands in a group, which I would have probably never found out myself. So don't be hesitant in discussing about your research with. If the professor is nice and if the professor is willing to talk to you, even if they don't take you up as a PhD, it's still a good opportunity to get to know about how the process works there, right? So just like, your first email obviously should be asking for an opening, and if they say that they don't have any funded openings, say you're still open to having a discussion with them and getting to know more about uh, well, how the how the thing works. So that's how I got my position. Like, I got to know about an advertisement in Netherlands, and that's how I got my position eventually. So that's all I would like to know.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe Puneet can.
Yeah. So, meanwhile, again, just if you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat. And if you want, yeah. So, couple of things just to add before I start talking about UK and other sort of institutes in Europe. Um, for interviews, this I think is generally true for all math interviews. In your field, prepare a few topics or theorems or proofs, not proofs, but at least theorems or statements that you prepare beforehand and sort of go over the proofs and the general idea and how those theorems are used, because that's definitely going to be a question. Unlike a lot of other interviews, in math interviews, they do ask you to sort of judge what you know, or how much to gauge what you have learned in your topic. So they might just ask you to sort of say, okay, what's your favorite theorem and can you give a proof? And they won't expect you to prove it like step by step with everything, but they will expect you to know a rough outline or the broad idea behind it. Or sometimes what they do is they sort of ask you for your favorite theorem, and then they will tell you, and that's literally how they ask you. They will ask you what is your favorite theorem, or like what is something which you would like to, what you think about more often. It's some weird way of asking things, and you won't really have a favorite theorem most of the time. Like, of course, sometimes you do. So have some things in mind, and they will ask you, okay, if that is your theorem, how is it actually used? or where is it most commonly put in play. And that, I think, everyone can have a few things at the back of your mind, and so that you can answer that when they come. So do prepare for your interviews, however formal, however informal it's going to be, because most math interviews, they do ask such questions. Writing an email, again, most of what Nandan said, keep your email content brisk. So a couple of lines about yourself, that which institute are you, what are you doing, what is, and then a couple of lines about your thesis, where you mention what your thesis title is, the broad field or broad question you're addressing, and your supervisors who are helping, who is supervising you, and then a couple of lines about what particularly in that lab interests you, and then just ask them if they have a position available or not. Another important thing is, just remember and don't be the judge of whether or not you're going to get the PhD. It's very common in maths to sort of think that, हमें कैसे ही मिलने वाला है ये position करके. Don't go in that mindset. The only way to assure failure is not to try. It's sort of something which I realized later on, that if he or she or they don't have a position, they will tell you, or they will say that, okay, they're not going to be polite and be like, how you apply even though you're not going to get it. So as and when you find people you want to work with, don't go behind, at least in Europe, because there are very few institutes which ask you for an application fee. Feel free to write to the, even if they ask, you can always write to the professor or first. So they will tell you if they have a position, they'll tell you if they have alternate funding sources and everything. And it's always write an email, and don't give up even before writing an email. So if you, because it's very difficult to come across positions which you like, so don't give up on them. uh, Another starting point is always talk to your current supervisors, right? I mean, they know your work best, even if the fields that you're planning to apply to may not be their field or center of interest, but they will still know people who might. And so it's always a good, and they know you the best in terms of what you do and what you know. Especially in math, the supervisors are quite involved in the projects themselves, so they do have a very good idea of what you might or might not be eligible for. So always talk to your supervisors first. Another thing which Nandan also said was papers, which is a very good point to start. Like, look at authors. Also remember that the first authors, since most math papers are also from quite a back, the first authors might also be supervisors by now. So this is something I realized, that I never looked at the first author and always used to look at the last author. And then I realized, and finally I applied to one who is the first author, and so on. And as I lastly, what I'll also add to what Nandan said about uh, where talking to people, even if they don't have a position, and they do end up suggesting things. And that's also what happened to me. One of the professors who I applied to didn't have a position, but she had a student who had just graduated and he was starting the lab. So that's where I'm also starting my PhD. So it's always a good thing to ask people when they say if they don't have a positions, if they have any other suggestions. So I think this is the general outline of what I wanted to add to what Nandan said. Now coming to the other part of it, the UK and sort of the non-standard applications. Uh, I'll also talk a bit about applying to interdisciplinary positions, which is what I also did. So I applied for positions in evolutionary theory. Before that, I'll again take a pause. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself. I'll wait for, say, half a minute or so.
I'll just add one point. I briefly read up a paper of some, like, by the prospective person.
Yeah.
Don't apply blindly. Like, read up what their research is and then apply. So that, and you can mention that in your email as well, that this is the paper that you read and found interesting. And by reading, I don't mean you need to know all the details of the paper. You should know the general idea of the paper, and that usually happens in interviews as well. If they ask you something about a paper, they won't ask you the details. They'll ask you, like, what was the brief, or what is the general idea behind the paper, so on.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah. Okay. So I guess. Another thing, even in the email, as I said, the email can be brisk, but you can always attach. You will, of course, always attach your CV. Okay, I mean, that's something I think is is expected. And also with the CV, you can attach sort of a SOP, another document where you outline a bit more about your research interest in a bit more detail and your interest in the lab, where you can add these details also, like the papers you read and why you're interested and so on. Okay, since there are no questions, I'll move on. Okay, so when applying to interdisciplinary positions, the problem is they are not always in the same department. So I applied for math bio positions where my applications ranged from hardcore math departments where I was asked questions which were proving theorems and uh, sort of talking about probability and stochastic processes, as through and all to proper biology departments like zoology and so on, where I was more generally asked about my work with. So if you're doing an interdisciplinary project, and it doesn't have to be as sort of math, but it can also be like a combination of abstract and applied mathematics, or you can have something like finance or economics in your project, and then you apply in that spectrum. Know how to present your thesis in both lights, right? You can since it's your thesis, it will always be you will be the one who knows the most about it. So you can share when you're giving an interview, or when they are asking you questions, you can frame your work in either of the lights. Like you can focus more on the math. So for me, I mean, math departments, I would focus more on theories and abstractions and subtleties of theorems, and also sort of saying that, okay, this is not something which people do, but it's important in terms of the framework of mathematics. Whereas if I was talking to a evolutionary theorist, I would rather talk about how that model is relevant in that biological field, or what are the aspects from biology which have been incorporated. If I'm talking to somebody in like a statistics department, I would rather be on the interface and say that, okay, this is how you translate from biology to mathematics and vice versa. So do be very well versed in being able to do that if you are doing this kind of neither here neither nor there kind of work. uh, yeah, and again, looking across departments. So that's why I think instead of looking at universities, it is a better starting point to start with professors and research papers and your supervisors, because sometimes they are not in the math department. The person that you want to work with, he or she might be in some other department. For me, they were spread across a multitude of departments, and I did miss out on a couple of people, the deadlines and all, just because I couldn't find them in time. So always like be a bit open about the department you want to join, and people generally will take math background students in either department. It's generally easier to get a position in some other department as well. Coming to UK applications, so UK applications are a mess in general. As much as you can search and apply for them, they are a headache to deal with. They don't have a very fixed kind of way in which you can apply and search for it, and therefore I wouldn't actually suggest going after UK people. But in case you do come across them, this is what you should do, and move around. So even in UK, there are two kinds of thing. One is the only place which does that is like Oxford and Cambridge, where they have a separate application procedure for the position, and then a separate application for the funding, which is completely independent. And they either they only do it at the back set, and it's not a linked thing. Like you can get a position and not get the funding, and so on. But there's another set of things which are much more easier to sort of, they are very competitive, but they are at least in a very systematized way, what are called as doctoral training programs. So they are called DTPs. And you can just go on, and this is what I did, and I did actually come up with really good positions which I applied and did get, was just go on Google and search doctoral training program in so and so topic, right? And you will come across a wide variety of programs. So these are sometimes institute specific, sometimes a multitude of institutes come together and organize this. So just type doctoral training programs and your topic and in Google search, and you'll come across it. I also shared findaphd.com, which does give a really good set of options to apply to. uh, the difference would be that DTPs are always funded, right? And but the problem is that I don't think there are many DTPs for pure math projects in general. And UK is in general not very conducive to non-applied research. Like most of their funding is always dedicated to things which are much more applied. And by applied, I don't even mean in terms of statistics. And they are like literally you're dealing with data and you're going to actually apply it some realistic scenario in something somewhere. So it's very difficult in general to go into UK for that. But if you do, then DTPs are there. DTPs are extremely competitive, but they have like a, but given our backgrounds from IISER, I do actually think that there is a decent chance of making it through in DTPs. When it comes to Oxford and Cambridge, these are the two institutes which are sort of also a, very in general their process is a bit different. So there you do actually apply to the programs at the university, and you can just write to the professor, and the professor will tell you what how to proceed and which programs to apply to in the university. And then later on there will be either so Oxford has separate funding programs, and they will contact you if you are eligible. Cambridge, if I'm not wrong, does that on their own. Like they again there also you don't really have to do anything from your side, but that's their process. I think generally these are the broad pointers for UK applications. But as I
Yeah.
said, don't
Can I
go
add
behind
something?
UK application. Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I mean, for people who are planning to apply to Cambridge, so when you apply to Cambridge, you also apply to a college separately, and some of the
Yeah,
scholarships are specifically tied to some specific colleges. So make sure. So, for example, some colleges have scholarships for specifically Indian students. So make sure you check that.
yeah, that's also true for Oxford, by the way. Yeah, okay, yeah, that's true. So I think in
Um,
general, but again, a major suggestion would be if you don't have much clue, don't go for UK positions in at least pure math. Like UK positions are just going to be a nightmare for you to traverse in general. But yeah,
I had just one suggestion, which is
yeah,
that I'm a physics major, and I noticed that there are specific websites for PhD positions in specific fields of research. So there's condensed matter physics websites, there's quantum physics websites. It might be possible that there are such things for math also, and I just wanted to ask if you guys are aware. Okay.
I never came across
For
anything.
physics, so I did find them, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I
Okay.
guess that's more or less, yeah. I think then
Physics.
interview. Yeah, I think, and one other institute which I will talk about is the Institute for Science and Technology (IST) at Austria. That is mostly like all the position. Like they are relatively a new institute, but they have really good groups working. And the unique part of it is it's a combination of the US and European systems, and it's a very unique institute in that regards. The most groups there are very interdisciplinary in that hardly you will find a group which is just one field, and they do all kinds of to date kind of work ranging from quantum to evolutionary theory to sort of computation kind of things like and they have a vast variety from physics, bio and math and data science. Chemistry department there is not there, but I guess that's not relevant for this group anyways. But they do have a really good set of people even in maths. And I definitely would suggest going through them. They have a proper one program which takes for all departments. They have 2 years of sort of general, you can look it up on yourself as well. I just type the name of the institute. If you type, it's like the only one there. There you will first apply, and then you will have to give an interview if you're selected. So there are two stages. One where they look at your application. So in that is the first stage where your application they gauge on based on your CV, on your SOP and stuff. And then they have an interview which is quite different from the other interviews that I gave. Yeah, that is true. Their website is pretty well organized. But what I did want to point out is that interviews are a bit different. They are not looking for people who know everything beforehand. So it's very, in general, no one is, but in that aspect, IST is actually helping, will help you shift fields, will help you try something new out. And therefore their interviews are also that general, like, so you just need to show what your interests are and which one do you wish to, like why do you want to get into the field and what eventually you want to get into, rather than what you know at the moment. They will gauge the way you think. I think that everyone does. They'll ask you questions which like what is your broad expectations and what you would want to apply eventually. But otherwise, it's a really good institute, and the application procedure is very different. It is a fully funded position, and the fundings are not, they are akin to European fundings, which is like more than enough for almost everything. It's not like day to day living kind of a situation. They do have really good funding for the program, as well as a wide multitude of areas where you can shift into, if even if at a later stage as well. Yeah, I guess those are the general pointers I have, and
Yeah.
yeah.
So, I mean, if I can trigger some discussion. So, since Europe usually has a 3-year PhD kind of thing, so do you think it's a good idea to try out for master's programs in Europe, which usually are for 1 or 2 years, and then for a PhD? Do you have anything to say about that?
Um, I do have something to say about it, in that it's even more difficult to get into master programs than PhD programs.
And
So, yeah,
and yeah, well, just add one point. It's not like you will be under equipped to do a PhD. Like you would have to work a bit. You would have to read up during your PhD, but it's not something that's impossible. I mean, you would be at an equal footing with others who are going to start their PhD.
yeah, and also I even though people sort of focus on the 3 year thing, the 3 year is also, it's important to note that the reason why non-Europeans like US and Canada kind of have a longer is not because that they, it's because they have other duties other than research, right? They have TA-ships and courses to do, which is not the case in most European PhDs. So in that sense, 3 years is not insufficient for doing a significant amount of research, and you can always expand more in your postdoc, so that gives you, that also gives you the room to do like 2 or 3 years of postdoc, which can be a multitude. So in general, I wouldn't suggest for master programs, just because they are a bit more difficult to get funding into, and they are costly, because there you will have to pay fees, so you will have to secure more funding, whereas PhD positions are a job in most of European countries, except UK, because it's UK. But most of the other European countries, the PhD is a job, so you do have a lot of other securities associated with it, which you won't get if you're a master's student. So if you have done a master's already in India, and even if you want to change field, try to find PhD positions where you can make the shift rather than doing another master's. But if you find a master's program and you think you have a good, and it's a funded position, then you can go ahead and do it. But in general, that would not be the suggestion.
Okay. Any questions at this point?
Yeah. Any questions at this point? I think we're up for questions.
Okay, if not, then I'll ask one. So, so since I mean, at least for physics, I noticed that European applications do emphasize a lot on your master's thesis, right? So, I mean, do you know of any positions where I mean, somebody has a chance of getting into if they want to work in something which is, let's say, completely different from what they worked in the masters?
Uh, there's a lot of background noise coming from somewhere. Is it me?
Yeah, probably me.
Oh, so okay.
Yeah, it's better
Huh.
now.
So one thing, as I said, IST is definitely that in Europe. It doesn't require you to get anything, but otherwise, yes, people do prefer students who have a background, just because, as you said, it's a 3 year position. So they do expect you to come with at least the background so that you can read the materials. I have not, in general, found people who have joined a new field. Um, Even though they don't have a background in that. In general, it's not the case, but IST definitely. Some of the DTP programs are aimed at that, but they are very rare. So there are some things called as interdisciplinary doctoral training programs, but they are very rare, and they are not really, they don't come out on regular intervals. So if you can come across such DTPs, well and good. But otherwise, I think Europe generally prefers if you have some background in that area beforehand. Yes.
More questions, but I would also like to say that, like Puneet said in the beginning, that shouldn't discourage you from applying. If you want to
Yes.
apply, you just apply. Whether you get it or not is the
Yeah.
next story.
Yeah.
Yeah, that I think is a very important point to make, right?
Yeah.
Just at least write to the professor is like the basic must. Even if you just think that how I just like it and I might be able to try it out. Worst case scenario, the PI is not going to waste his time if he thinks that it's not. But you don't be the judge of that and milega, nahi milega, milega. Let the PI make that call. So you can always write for sure.
So questions? Anyone with questions?
Yeah, another suggestion would be since the sessions are recorded, the other sessions have a look at it because I think general advice there are also pretty good. So I attended the bio session for sure, and they did the general outlines and suggestions for writing emails and pretty much what we said, and a lot of other things also. Most of it is relevant. The way to approach interview questions is the same, right? And this is and something which is there. Ask questions at the end of the interview. That is something even I will suggest because they do ask you to. So they will at the end of the interview ask you if you have any questions. Uh, have something in mind. It can be about the program. You can just ask, okay, does this program have something? For me, the go-to question always used to be if it was a bio, I used to ask other ways I can interact with the math department, or if it was the math DTP, I would just ask if there are ways to interact with the bio department. So anything that you find relevant to your what you envision for yourself, always ask questions, even if you don't really want an answer, like, but still ask a question because they expect you to. Like the way you should be doing now, but anyways, so do definitely ask questions at the end. Yeah.
I would often ask them about what they like about the city, because if I have to live in the
Yeah,
city, like
yeah,
I need
exactly.
to. Yeah.
That is actually a very strong point. That don't just look at your academics. Of course, it's a major point, and be sure that you're interested and whatever. But do have some idea of the place where you're going and the situation around. Sometimes it might matter to you as well. So yeah, do ask about that. Talk to last thing. Talk to PhD students in that lab beforehand because that's very important. The most important thing is what kind of a supervisor he or she is. It doesn't really matter what many publications they have and blah blah blah, and if they end up to be a tyrant and who just, and I have seen that happen. So make sure you talk to previous students. If he or she is a new PI, make sure you talk to their some person who knows them. Otherwise, be a bit skeptic because sometimes new PIs, they tend to be helpful in the beginning because they want to get things done, but otherwise, it can happen either way. So don't think too much about whether the PI is new or he's established or he or she has done a lot of work or they haven't done a lot of work. It's your PhD, you're the one who's going to spearhead it. But always try to gauge whether or not the PI is helpful, he's considerate about things which are not, especially in the middle of the pandemic. I cannot emphasize how many times I've had to rely on the help of my PI to get things done. And if he was very indifferent to personal things happening, it would have been a nightmare to get anything done. So do try to gauge. For me, I even though my PI is a new one, I got to know him because my supervisor knew him on a personal basis. So they, any way you can gauge a person, try and do that because it is important. Yeah. I think we're coming to an end also.
Yeah. So any more questions? One thing you could do, Puneet and Nandan, you could put up your email IDs in the chat.
Yeah, I'm also go on Twitter and all the social media. At least I think Twitter is a good place to look for PhDs as well. Follow, or I got a couple of positions which I applied for through Twitter, and I keep coming across them. Follow everyone who you think is your major leading person in your field. They will share a lot of things. I am putting my email address. Uh, do you need anything else? I'm putting my email address. You can contact me there. I normally will reply. So
Okay. We'll wait for, let's say, 10-15 more seconds. If there's no questions, we can end. Yeah. But I think this has been very useful. I also learned a lot of things here that I wish I had known last year.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, to people who are attending, one request is that you could, I mean, if you have something to say, please send us feedback on, I mean, how, what could we have done better, because we are also planning to have sessions on
Yeah.
India, US,
Next
and
week.
other places. So I mean, if you think that there's something that we can do better, please let us know. So you
Yeah,
can
for
write to
instance,
me
do
or
you
Shashank or
actually
anybody.
want present? So we didn't put up a presentation because normally we do, and it's not really a lot of help for anyone. If you found that it was a bit difficult to follow the conversation, you can just write it, and we can try to put up some summaries at the end of it. But since the session's recorded, you can always go back. But yeah.
Yes. This session will be recorded and like we'll share it with you in some manner, YouTube or something. But, okay, I think let's close it here. Thanks, Puneet and Nandan. This has been very helpful. If you have any more questions, you can ask us or Puneet and Nandan at their email IDs. So yeah. Thank you all.
Thanks
Take care.
for
Okay,
organizing both of you.
Bye.
yeah, thanks. Nice to see you
Bye
all.
bye.
Bye.
Yeah, same. Bye.